I worked as a structural survey contractor for 8 years before I took the position that brought me to the Appalachian region of Western Virginia, and I want to be specific about what structural survey work involves before I describe what happened, because the nature of the work is directly relevant to why I was where I was and what I was doing when things went wrong. Structural survey contractors assess the condition of infrastructure in remote or difficult access locations. Bridges, tunnels, retaining walls, the kind of built environment that exists in places where regular inspection is complicated by terrain or access. The work requires comfort with physically challenging environments, the ability to work alone or in small teams in locations with no reliable communication, and a systematic approach to documentation that keeps your attention on specific technical details rather than on the general character of the environment you are working in. I was good at the work. I had assessed infrastructure in some of the most remote terrain in the eastern United States, and I had done it without any incident for 8 years. The assignment that brought me to Western Virginia was the assessment of a series of historic stone arch bridges on an abandoned rail corridor that ran through the Appalachian Highlands. The corridor had been out of service for decades, and the bridges, some of them a century old, were being assessed for a potential trail conversion project. There were 11 bridges on the corridor section I had been contracted to assess, ranging from small, single-arch crossings to a substantial multi-arch structure at the deepest point of a river gorge. The assessment required close physical examination of each structure and detailed photographic documentation, work that could not be done quickly and that required returning to each bridge multiple times to complete the full scope. The assessment was a 10-day job and I was the sole contractor for the initial phase, which meant I was working alone. I had rented a cabin in the nearest town, about 22 miles from the start of the corridor, and I was driving to the access points each day and hiking in to the bridges on the old rail bed. The terrain was challenging and the rail bed in places had been substantially reclaimed by the forest, but the route was followable and I had detailed historical maps of the corridor. I had completed assessments of the first 7 bridges over 5 days without any significant difficulty. The structures were in various states of deterioration, but all were accessible and all were within the expected parameters of a century-old rail infrastructure on an abandoned corridor. My documentation was thorough, and I was ahead of schedule. On the 6th day, I was working on the 8th bridge, a triple-arch stone crossing over a tributary creek, and I had stayed later than I intended because the light on the underside of the arches was better in the late afternoon, and I had wanted to complete the arch barrel documentation before returning. By the time I was finished and packing my equipment, it was past 7 and the light was failing in the gorge below the bridge. I made the decision to camp at the bridge location rather than hike out in the dark on a partially overgrown rail bed. I had camping equipment in my pack because the nature of the work made overnight stays in the field a regular occurrence. I set up my tent on a flat area near the bridge abutment and I made a simple dinner, and I went through my documentation for the day, and by 9 I was settled in for the night. The first thing I noticed was the silence around the bridge at that hour, which was different from the silence I had experienced at the other bridge locations where I had camped. The tributary creek that passed under the bridge was audible, which was the expected ambient sound for that location, but the forest on both sides of the corridor was producing no sound at all. Not reduced sound, not occasional sound. No sound. I had camped in the Appalachian forest before and I knew the specific layered sound of a forest at night, the insects and the frogs and the occasional bird. None of those sounds were present at this location at this hour, which was notable and which I noted in my field journal without attaching a specific interpretation to it. At approximately 11, I heard something from inside the bridge. I want to be specific about what I mean because the phrasing matters technically. The bridge was a triple-arch stone structure carrying the rail bed over the creek approximately 30 feet below. The bridge itself was solid masonry and enclosed no interior space in the way a building would. There was no space inside the bridge in any structural sense. What there was, in a triple-arch structure of this design, was the space between the spandrel walls. the portion of the bridge between the top of the arches and the surface of the rail bed, which in some historic bridge designs was filled with rubble and in others was partially hollow depending on the construction method. I did not know the construction method for this specific bridge because I had not yet completed the documentation of the spandrel section. What I heard from inside the bridge at 11 at night was a low rhythmic sound that I am going to describe as impact-based, the specific quality of something making repeated contact with a solid surface at a consistent interval. Not continuous, not random, rhythmic in the way that a deliberate action is rhythmic, with a consistent pace and a consistent quality of contact. It was coming from within the bridge structure itself, from the area above the arches and below the rail bed surface. I did not investigate it immediately. I sat in my tent and I listened to it, and I applied my structural knowledge to the available explanations. Thermal expansion and contraction in masonry structures produce sounds, but not rhythmic impact sounds with that specific quality. Bats roosted in historic bridge structures and were a common feature of this type of environment, but bats did not produce impact sounds of that kind. Water movement through bridge drainage systems could produce sounds, but the drainage for this bridge emptied at the abutment faces, and I had examined both of them during the day and knew what that drainage sounded like. I noted the sound in my field journal at 11:14 and I documented its character as precisely as I could manage, and I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to it for approximately 20 minutes before it stopped. The second event happened at approximately 1 in the morning, and it was the one that moved the situation from something I was documenting professionally to something I was responding to personally. I woke from a shallow sleep to find that the tent was illuminated. Not by my headlamp, which was off. Not by moonlight, because the gorge position of the camp meant the sky above was a narrow corridor and the moon was not at an angle that would reach the gorge floor at that hour. The tent fabric was illuminated from outside by a light source that was close enough to the tent to illuminate the fabric from within, creating the specific silhouette effect that occurs when a light source is near enough to a tent wall to backlight the fabric. I lay completely still and I looked at the tent ceiling above me, and it was illuminated. The light was not moving. It was not sweeping across the tent the way a flashlight beam moving past would sweep. It was stationary, as though the source was positioned within a few feet of the tent wall and was simply present. I lay still for what I estimate was several minutes, and the illumination did not change and did not move. I reached for my headlamp, which was beside my sleeping bag, and I turned it on. The moment I turned on my headlamp, the exterior illumination ceased. Immediately, as though the activation of my own light had caused the exterior light to be extinguished. I sat up and unzipped the tent and looked out with my headlamp. The bridge was there. The rail bed surface was there. The abutment was there. The creek was audible below. The forest on both sides of the corridor was dark. There was no person, no light source, no equipment, nothing in the immediate area of my camp that could have produced the illumination I had seen through the tent fabric. I held my headlamp at various angles, looking at the bridge surface and the ground around the tent, and found nothing. I went back into the tent and I sat there and I thought about the two events, the rhythmic impact sound from inside the bridge at 11 and the stationary light source outside the tent at 1 in the morning, and I tried to build a version of events that accommodated both of them without requiring an explanation that I could not professionally defend. The bridge sound I could place within the range of structural phenomenon, stretched and requiring generous interpretation but available. The light I could not explain at all. A stationary light source that ceased the moment I activated my own light had no structural or environmental explanation that I could construct. I completed the field journal entry for the second event at 1:22, and I remained in the tent until first light, which at that time of year and in that gorge position meant waiting until past 7 in the morning before the light in the gorge was sufficient to work by. I completed the assessment of Bridge 8 the following morning, and I did not camp at the site again. We rented a cabin in the Appalachian region, and there were 5 of us in it. I want to be specific about who we were because the specific composition of the group matters for understanding the dynamic of what happened and why we responded the way we did. Myself, my husband Kevin, my sister Renee, and Renee's 2 college friends, a woman named Simone and a man named Patrick, who we had met a handful of times before at various family events, and who we knew well enough to spend a long weekend with, but not well enough to predict how they would handle something unexpected. That distinction became relevant. Kevin had booked a cabin, a 4-bedroom log structure in the mountains of western North Carolina near the Tennessee border, through a regional rental agency that he had used twice before for other trips. The property was about 3 miles from the nearest town on a gravel road that ended at the cabin's clearing, and the surrounding terrain was dense Appalachian forest on all sides, with a creek visible from the back porch. The listing described it as having limited cell service and no cable, which we had all accepted as part of the experience. We arrived on a Friday evening in late October, when the leaves were at their peak color, though we could not see the color in the dark when we pulled in, only the shapes of the trees in the headlights. The first evening was exactly what a first evening at a mountain cabin should be: dinner, a fire, the specific decompression that happens when 5 adults who all work too hard finally have permission to do nothing. We stayed up later than we should have, and we went to bed in the specific comfortable state of people who had already decided the weekend was going to be good. Saturday was good. We hiked in the morning on a trail that accessed the property from the Forest Service road, cooked a large midday meal, and spent the afternoon on the back porch with the creek and the October color in view. It was genuinely one of those days that justifies the effort of planning a trip, the kind you remember as better than the photographs you take of it. Saturday night was when it started. We had been in bed for about 2 hours when I woke up. I do not know what woke me. Kevin was asleep beside me. The cabin was quiet. I lay still for a moment and then I heard it. A sound from outside the cabin, from the direction of the tree line, at the back of the property behind the creek. It was a sound I am going to describe carefully because the description is where the specific wrongness of it lives. It was rhythmic, consistent in interval, regular in its spacing, like something being struck against a surface at a steady pace. Not fast, not urgent, deliberate. The pace of something being done with intention rather than accidentally or randomly. I put my hand on Kevin's shoulder and he woke up. I did not say anything. I just pointed toward the back of the cabin and he lay still and listened. After a few seconds he nodded, which told me he had heard it. We lay there and listened to the sound for what I estimate was about 3 minutes, and then it stopped. Kevin said it was probably an animal, possibly a woodpecker in the dark, which was possible, but which I had also never heard of, and which Kevin himself did not sound entirely convinced by. We went back to sleep. In the morning over breakfast, I mentioned it to the group. Simone said she had heard it too, had woken up around the same time, and had listened to it from her room on the other side of the cabin until it stopped. Patrick said he had slept through it. Renee said she had been awake for some time before it started and had heard it begin, and that the sound had seemed to her to be moving, not stationary. She said it had started from the direction of the tree line and had then gradually shifted position, moving from left to right across the back of the property, maintaining its rhythm the whole time before stopping at the right end of the property near where the creek curved away into the forest. That detail, the movement of the sound, was the one I had not registered, but that Renee's account produced in me the specific retrospective recognition of something I had half noticed and filed away. In the 3 minutes I had been listening, I had perceived the sound as coming from a consistent direction. But now that Renee had named the movement, I could access the specific sensory memory of it, and I understood that she was right. It had been moving, and I had not fully registered the movement as I was experiencing it. We did not discuss it at great length that morning. We went for a shorter hike in the afternoon and we came back to the cabin and made dinner, and the day was pleasant, and the night was something we were all aware of approaching with a low-level awareness that none of us named. Directly. The sound began again at approximately the same time Saturday night sound had begun, just past midnight. I was not asleep this time. I do not think any of us were, though we had not said so to each other when we went to bed at 11. I was lying in the dark, listening to the cabin in the forest, and at 12:15 I heard the first impact sound, and I was out of bed before the second one. We all converged in the main room within about a minute, all 5 of us. which told me that none of us had been sleeping and all of us had been waiting for it. We stood in the main room and listened to the sound through the back wall of the cabin, through the wall that faced the creek and the tree line, and it was louder inside than it had seemed in the bedroom the previous night. Clearer. The individual impacts were more defined, each one a specific contact between something and a surface, spaced at a consistent interval of approximately 4 seconds. Kevin went to the back window and looked out at the creek and the tree line. He stood at the window for about 30 seconds, and then he said, quietly, that there was something at the tree line. Not someone. Something. He used the word deliberately, and when Renee asked him to be specific, he said he could see a shape at the edge of the trees, in the darkness at the right side of the property where the creek curved away, and that the shape was not moving, but that the sound seemed to be coming from its position. Renee went to the window beside Kevin and looked. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she could see it too. I did not go to the window. I stood in the main room and I listened to the sound, and I thought about what we were going to do, which was the practical question that I was able to think about because I had decided not to look at what was at the tree line until I decided what to do about it. Patrick said we should go out and look, and Simone said we should not, and Kevin said we should turn on the exterior lights and see what they showed. The exterior lights covered the back porch and approximately 30 feet of the yard toward the creek. Kevin turned them on from the switch beside the back door, and we all went to the back windows. The exterior lights showed the porch, the yard, the creek. The tree line on the right side of the property at the creek curve was at the edge of the exterior light reach, partially illuminated and partially in darkness. At the edge of the light, at the exact position where Kevin and Renee had seen the shape, there was nothing. The shape was gone. The sound had stopped at the moment Kevin had reached for the light switch, in the specific way that a sound stops when the action of reaching for a light switch is visible from outside through a window. We stood at the back windows and looked at the empty edge of the exterior light reach for several minutes. Nothing returned. The creek was visible, and the tree line was visible, and there was nothing at the position where the shape had been. Nobody went back to bed. We made coffee, and we sat in the main room, and we talked about it, and the conversation had the specific quality of 5 adults who were all independently trying to build a version of events that was comfortable and that none of them was fully managing. Animals made rhythmic sounds sometimes. A woodpecker in distress, a grouse drumming, various explanations that had the right general shape, but that did not fit the specific details of what we had heard, the consistency of the interval, the movement of the sound across the property, the cessation at the exact moment the light switch was reached for. At 4 a.m, Patrick said he was going to look at the tree line area from outside, and Kevin said he would go with him. I did not try to stop them because they were adults and the exterior lights were on, and it was 4 a.m. and nothing had happened in the 4 hours since the sound had stopped. They went out through the back door and across the yard to the creek and along the creek to the right side of the property where the shape had been at the tree line. They were outside for about 12 minutes. When they came back in, Kevin's expression told me before he spoke that they had found something. He said there were marks on the trees at the position where the shape had been, marks on the trunks of 3 specific trees at the edge of the tree line, at approximately chest height, that had the character of repeated impact marks. The bark damaged at those specific points in a way that was consistent with the sound we had been hearing, something making repeated contact with the tree trunks at a consistent height. Not an animal foraging, not weather damage. Repeated impact marks at a consistent height on 3 specific trees, spaced in a way that described a specific position in the tree line from which the sounds had been produced. We checked out of the cabin at 6 a.m. We were back on the gravel road before full dawn. We drove to the nearest town and got breakfast at a diner that was just opening, and we sat there for an hour and we talked about everything we had heard and seen and found, and we could not build a comfortable version of it. We tried. We are all practical, educated people with specific professional competences and the collective cognitive resources to construct an explanation for most things. We could not construct one for the marks on the trees, the movement of the sound, and the cessation at the moment of the light switch. We drove home separately, the Nashville group and the Charlotte group taking their different directions from the mountain town, and we did not talk very much during the drive. Kevin and I drove 3 hours back to Charlotte in the specific quiet of two people who have shared something that neither of them has language for yet, and we pulled into our driveway and sat in the car for a minute and then went inside, and Kevin locked the door behind us, which was not something he always did immediately on arriving home, and neither of us said anything about the fact that he did it.